I think it's fair to say that networking trends have been a bit of a roller coaster the last few years. From the explosion of remote work in 2020 to reopening offices in 2021 and adapting to hybrid work in 2022, networking leaders have been under a lot of pressure. But within these tectonic shifts, we've witnessed some very definitive advancements. SASE has transformed from head-scratching hype cycle to now a widely deployed solution. Private wireless has matured and expanded the number of enterprise use cases. And Wi-Fi 6E is ready, perhaps already handling your bandwidth-hungry, high-density environments. So my point is that options abound, but our choices remain difficult. Well, the Worldwide Technology Research Report on Network Priorities for 2022, last year, mainly centered around awareness of what was gaining traction. The 2023 report featured in today's show is less about awareness and more about taking action. So we've already recorded 2 fantastic shows on, wireless strategy and the other on converged networking. Now I'll tell you why these are important at the end, so hang on. Today, however, my guest is Tom Schepers, Senior Practice Manager for WWT's Edge to Cloud team. He is adding to this corpus of networking knowledge with expertise and guidance on priority 2, secure and optimize your WAN. My name is Rob Boyd. I want to thank you for joining us. Welcome to WWT Reports Research, accelerating results through the wisdom and achievements of those who came before us. Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining us on WWT Reports. Specifically, priority number 2, of course, we're diving into this notion of optimizing the WAN, secure and optimize, which has some implications in it. But before we get into that, for anybody that may not have had the pleasure of working with you at Worldwide or other places that you've been, I wonder if you could give us a brief, what do you do now for Worldwide, and kind of briefly, what's your background?
Yeah, well, I appreciate you having me here, Rob. Good to see you again, as always. So I'm the Senior Practice Manager here at Worldwide of what we call our Secure Edge to Cloud team. Essentially what that means is my team's responsible for the go-to-market for SD-WAN and SSE. So in essence, Gartner's definition of SASE. Right? So we're responsible for enablement, customer engagement, briefings, things like that. Right? Been doing it with Worldwide just over 5 years. Prior to that, I had a 2-year self-employed moment where I was doing some consulting for a software startup out of California. And then prior to that, I spent 20 years as a SC and a DSC at Cisco Systems.
Yeah, some good memories, and you've worked with a lot of smart people. You've got some pedigree there. So let me ask you, in a moment ago, you just said the Gartner definition of SASE. What was that? I may have missed how you were referring to that. You said, I know Gartner has labeled it, but did you say that was equivalent to SD-WAN, surely?
Well, it's equivalent to SD-WAN plus SSE. Right.
Okay.
So if you look at the Gartner definition of SASE, there's really 2 components. There's the network services side, which SD-WAN is a major component of. And then there's the SSE side, or the cloud delivered security side, right, which is CASB, SWG, data loss prevention, ZTNA, right. All that.
Is that the right way to proceed then? Because there's a bit of an assumption, I feel like, in this priority report, priority 2, when we're talking about the WAN, it immediately goes into SD-WAN as being the definition of WAN. Is that a safe assumption for most WANs these days and anybody that may be watching this?
For the vast majority, perhaps. I think a lot of people who are on what we'll call legacy WANs are not necessarily looking at the SSE side because you need the direct internet access component. That's a big part of what SD-WAN brought, was that path diversity option, right? So you had the MPLS. Traditionally, SD-WAN brought in that, that dynamic path optimization where you could offload traffic in an active-active method to an internet path and cut your WAN costs on the MPLS side. So for the most part, you're really probably talking SD-WAN. It's not by definition SD-WAN, but you're probably really heading that direction.
And normally SD-WAN, though, does support multiple transport networks, right? So, but are we seeing a move? Have you seen a significant decrease in the use of MPLS, for instance? Or is that still pretty solid in there? Is there a need for that?
So there's still a need. Some companies still want to have that private connectivity for whether they have it from a perceived regulatory standpoint. They want the private network connectivity. And they want some guaranteed SLAs perhaps on some specific real-time applications. It's historically been one MPLS with one internet circuit. There have been some who have said, well, we'll do 2 internet circuits and just plan on one of them always being there, right? Where you don't have an SLA on internet, but you have an SLA when you have MPLS, right? So between the privacy and the SLA, I think there's still a lot of people that are using MPLS. What they're not doing is adding bandwidth to their MPLS circuits.
Yeah, it's not cost effective.
Instead of taking their 10 meg MPLS circuit to a 20 meg, they're leaving it at 10 and getting a 100 meg internet circuit for less money.
I gotcha.
So it's a cost-effective methodology in SD-WAN.
And there's no issue with still supporting those MPLS circuits if you're more in the SASE direction, correct? Because it's just a matter of, is it just more of how much you're using cloud as your interface and your centralized management, maybe where your security is being executed? Or what's important to understand about those differences and what can be done or not done?
If you're still using MPLS, the predominant applications you're going to see there are probably the ones going to your own data centers.
Okay, yeah.
Right? And, so your private connectivity. If you're starting to leverage things like WebEx or Office 365 from a SaaS perspective, or you're using Azure, AWS, or GCP, then you might be more apt to take the route to an SSE provider, which is going to be predominantly internet-based over tunnel technology.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Well, I appreciate you letting me ask the junior questions because I just want to make sure that also, of course, I know all the answers to these, but no. The assumption is I don't want to leave anybody out from an audience perspective. And because if we're doubling down from this paper's perspective in terms of SD-WAN and we're talking about optimizing your SD-WAN, well, first, why is WAN optimization perhaps on a priority list that a lot of times, well, I wouldn't say it's all characterized by new technology because it's really not. But what would be your reasoning for saying, yes, these securing and optimizing WAN is definitely a priority for 2023 and beyond?
So a couple reasons. One, I think is people have moved more to things like Office 365 on that. The path optimization element and doing intelligent path choice to get to the applications with the least latency and most securely is a big part of user experience.
Okay.
Right? I'll give you an example, right? If I'm in St. Louis and I have to go to if my office headquarters and data centers in San Jose, but I want to access something in New York, do I really want to backhaul all the way to San Jose and then all the way back to New York to get to a GCP instance, or do I just want to go straight to New York?
Well, a lot of people have been put in that situation because they somewhat took SD-WAN and simply emulated the previous architecture in terms of the layout. And is it correct to assume that, well, that makes sense to do this because perhaps that was the first part of the investment to get into that? It didn't make sense to relocate security and some of the path optimization maybe wasn't cost effective in that moment. And that's why we're saying now, let's revisit and say, how can you make this better? Perhaps even returning to your original intentions.
Yeah, and I think that's a good part of it, right? Okay. I think there's other things that come into play too. So like I mentioned earlier, the cloud optimization. As you start to put more and more applications into the public cloud, are you accessing those in the most reliable and efficient manner, right? Are you giving the right user experience to your customers in the company, right? Same thing with software as a service. So as we do more and more of that, are we giving that experience, the best experience in a secure manner to our internal users? At the same time, you start thinking about over the last couple of years, we've now got a lot of people working from home. Yeah. Like right now, I'm working out of my house, right?
Myself as well.
This is my home office,
yep.
Right? So when you look at zero trust network access and stuff, how are we bringing that as part of this element as well, right? Because if you look at SD-WAN and moving those users into their home environment, SSE comes in as a big part of that to help optimize that experience and keep it on a single policy and from a security perspective and application access.
Yeah. Well, and it feels like when we talk about up leveling, or what's the term that was used, level up, I think is talking about leveling up your SD-WAN investment. The elements that are kind of called out here are really around security, as you've already been mentioning. We'll go into that a little bit deeper, but they're also around public cloud access, which made me think, are there implementations of SD-WAN where the cloud is not integrated perhaps in the most optimal fashion, or is it surely it's not integrated at all? Because I feel like everybody's using SASE to some, or not SASE, but cloud-based services to some extent.
There are variations, right? So depending upon the OEM you're working with, right, they have different implementations of what we'll loosely call cloud on-ramp. Some instances have optimized their connectivity into the public providers, where now you're using their direct connect, so you're not using yours. It makes the actual access much easier and more cost-effective. At the same time, you've got instances where the SD-WAN OEM is gathering data from, say, Microsoft and getting analytics from Microsoft Office 365 they're not only using their network analytics, but they're using Microsoft analytics to pick the best path to get you to Office 365.
Which is a good thing, right?
That's an absolutely great thing. And not, so like I said, there's variations of instances and how different SD-WAN OEMs do that. Some have integrations directly into the clouds and directly into, the SaaS providers. Some do not.
So this would be a little bit of a recap, but just don't want to make sure that I'm not putting words in your mouth. This is among the things that you would say you would put in your personal definition of what's recommended for an SD-WAN implementation. If you don't have an optimized route to your most important cloud providers, if your security is not in a place where it can be used in an optimal fashion, are these correct? And are there other things that you think should be considered?
I think those are the two big ones we're seeing right now. I think the third one that we're seeing, and we're seeing more of this being adopted, and it is pretty well universally adopted now from the OEM perspective, is having firewalls embedded in the CPE gear of the SD-WAN as well. While SSE and the tunneling takes care of your north-south traffic, what it doesn't do is do east-west.
Okay.
So I want to protect my east-west traffic internal to my company. So I still need that. I still want that firewall capability embedded in the SD-WAN router at the branch.
Okay. That's a good distinction, because I guess and everybody's going to be different in terms of how much they've moved to cloud-based services and how much of their traffic is going these directions. But you've highlighted there multiple points. So you must be seeing in the market multiple clients that kind of have left this out, or either have moved on to other projects and just haven't finished kind of doing everything they can to get the most out of their previous investments, it sounds like.
Well, you think back, SD-WAN's been around, 7-8 years now?
Yeah, it's much more solidified than it used to be.
With the early adoption of, the companies like Vitello and stuff, right? A lot of this technology for the early adopters wasn't there.
Yeah.
Right? Some of the cloud on-ramp stuff is within the last few years. So that's really been getting elevated and doing more and more of that over the last few years. So now as those companies are coming up on a refresh, we're in a pretty big refresh cycle for early adopters right now. And so what we're seeing is they're really looking back and, okay, now what else can I do to make this environment better? If I'm going to reinvest and up for another 3 or 5 years, what else do I need to do that, been, come up in the last few years that I can look at to adopt to increase the value of my, my investment here?
Okay. And some of that, because I was trying to look, it felt like some of the differences, if we were trying to distinguish between SD-WAN and then kind of the SASE version of that, so to speak, it felt like there's a heavier emphasis on cloud management and oversight, perhaps, less on the CPE side, except where necessary. Is that accurate, or is that just too simple?
That's probably somewhat fair, right? I think there's some, the SSE has really come into the last couple of years. When I look at our historical, we really started seeing a big adoption of SSE as part of this. About 3 years ago, it started to take off. This year, in 2023, we're seeing a phenomenal ramp up of companies adopting SSE because they really want to get that direct connectivity into the SaaS and cloud providers in a secure way, right? So that's becoming more and more to the forefront in how they want to drive this. And there's multiple use cases around that are driving it, right? So the remote workforce, hybrid workforce is a big driver. Egress to cloud, as we call it, is another driver. Mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures has become big, right? So how do if I'm going to spin off a company, how do I get them into a secure environment quickly and stuff? Well, SSE plays a great role there because you're acquiring a service, not having to buy all hardware and stuff, right? So there's some things around mergers, acquisitions, and divestiture, and there's other emerging use cases we're starting to see. So I think there's some very specific use cases around what's driving the SSE adoption.
Well, and doubling down on SSE for just a moment. So on one hand, and this is maybe an old thought, I felt like SSE, maybe it first came about with regards to vendors who could not provide the WAN portions of some of the solution. And so there was a little bit of carving out of for security-oriented vendors, maybe that didn't have that. That could be an old notion and certainly reflects some of my biases. But then I also feel like from a security perspective that SSE becomes an oversimplified way of saying security, but you really got to peel that back and say, well, what do you mean by security? Because as you've already mentioned, ZTNA, CASB, firewalls, there's a lot of different security things that are important and necessary at different levels, depending on what your posture is and what your goals are and budget and so forth. But is there any risk of SSE oversimplifying the need for security and not naturally begging the right questions to say, well, what specifically within SSE?
Yeah, I think there's potentially that. I think there's a lot of presentation. Oh, look, you're just firing up a tunnel from the router to the SSE provider, and the message gets simple. SSE in itself, while you're right, it has a lot of components to it, right? Whether it's the cloud access security broker and the data loss prevention and the software, the secure web gateway and whatnot. It's really the thought process of coming in. What are the use cases? What are you actually trying to drive, and how do you use those?
Yeah.
Right. So how do you build policies for those, and really drive that implementation?
But you're not.
But it does not negate the need for a lot of your other security, like on-prem firewalls, as we mentioned earlier, for the branch. If I want to go east-west, like branch to branch, SSE is not going to solve that problem.
You know what I'm saying? In other words, does it imply a certain degree of things so that I know if you're saying, yes, we've invested in SSE, and then you go, oh, well, are you doing anything on this? Are you doing anything on this? Or what kind of questions you have to ask to figure out what they're really doing?
Yeah, I think there's questions you have to ask because, there's a lot of companies out there that say do SSE. What they do in SSE, your mileage will vary, as you will say, right? So some implementations may or may not have a next-gen firewall as a service in it, right? So it really depends upon what the SSE provider you're talking to really has embedded in their platform.
Yeah. It reminds me, since you go back in the Cisco days, it reminds me of the built-in security that we would not do a very good job of selling with ISRs, or the integrated service routers, and at Cisco. And I think a lot of it is because it would get sold as or an add-on, or maybe it was even added to juice a sale and show, to get a price to a certain level by bundling more stuff in. But it's like whether someone turned it on and whether or not they were managing it appropriately. Did it do a good job of saying you don't need to invest in some other things because it could be taken care of at that point of presence? And it kind of feels like that, where it's like, okay, we have to fight the oversimplification of security to a certain, with some people, obviously not with security people. But I don't know. Just reminds me of certain things.
Yeah. Well, and security is one of those things that it's a layered approach, and most companies are averse to taking anything out once they have it in. So
yeah. Well, and how obvious is it do people when we think about our audience that reading over these priorities? Do you think most people that should know are already aware of their network flows maybe not being optimized to where they want? That's certainly not new information, is it? Or are they already seeing signs that they need to do something about this, and this helps them in that direction?
I would think most are probably aware, right? They know where their trouble points are, and if they don't have direct access to cloud, and they know that they probably see it in the fact that if they're going to cloud and they don't have direct access, they're having to constantly upgrade the bandwidth out of their data center to the cloud because people keep going that route. And they're probably getting a ton of complaints about performance.
Because it's trending in the wrong direction, right?
So I'm imagine they're fairly aware.
Yeah, so it's trending in the wrong direction, and that the more cloud you pick up is going to highlight the more inefficiencies you've got in your network pathing. And that pathing, a lot of it also is about doing security correctly, because that pathing may be forced in certain directions because of the fact that it's being unnaturally routed through security. And what we're proposing here is that's your next step, is to say, you need to optimize this for a better end user experience, because certainly over the last few years, before, since SD-WAN has come about, I guarantee everybody's network path has changed, or everyone's actual traffic is really shifting into some strange locations that we may not have as much insight to, visibility or security.
Well, I think you just hit on a key word too. I think something that's become more mature in the last couple of years as well is the ability to get real deep analytics and visibility into the networks, right? To really help it. But, to help that help desk resolve problems faster and get to that mean time to innocence, right? So when you look at, what come up with some of the dashboards and stuff, actually really doing end-to-end analytics, whether it's from the SD-WAN provider or a third party, that's become much bigger in the last few years as well, just because of the complexity of the SD-WAN and driving, trying to drive more of that visibility so I can get that reliability higher.
Yeah.
Like I said, that mean time.
And that was kind of what would hold some people back in the early days, which is you don't want to put things on the internet links because it felt like the big black unknown of whether or not traffic was going to be consistent or not. And you didn't know, and you just kind of, it worked 30 minutes ago, but the next minute it doesn't. Is the visibility and the tooling improved to make this a much easier I think things have improved to where we don't see some of the same stoppages, but are we seeing better visibility and that implementation is not as scary maybe as it used to be?
Yeah, I think there's a lot better visibility tools that are being offered, right? There's been a lot more maturity in that market, whether, again, it's from the primary SD-WAN vendor or a third party. So there's been some pretty good advancements, and you can get pretty granular details, and not just in your network, but in the internet that you're using as well as transport potentially. You start getting more visibility there using some of these tools. So the granularity's got much, much better over the last, like I said, 7 years or so since the onslaught of SD-WAN.
Well, and I was looking, and so also in this paper there's this notion, forgive me because I'm not seeing the term right in front of me. Is it branch of one? Kind of a full.
So there were a couple terms in there. There was a branch of one, and then there was SD branch.
Can you define those and then maybe distinguish between them?
So branch of one is basically what I'm doing right now, right? If I had an application and I'm sitting in my home and I'm just working, and I had a connectivity to the SD-WAN for my home, and I'm just very simplified mechanism out of my house. SD branch is something we're starting to see come more in more recent days. Is the idea if I'm in a branch and I've got wireless access points and controller, I've got wired infrastructure, I've got a router CPE, which may have an embedded firewall, I may have an adjacent firewall. That's several control points in that branch. The idea of an SD branch is making that a unified approach to a structure that's under one tool for orchestration, management, and visibility, right? So I got common features. I've got one screen that I'm looking at instead of doing the chair swivel to see where my problem in the branch is. Right? Looking at different dashboards for wired and wireless versus the firewall versus the router. The SD branch is that like I said, a unified view of what a stack in the branch would operate as.
And I would assume that's not a stack you're building from multiple vendors. It sounds like it's probably a single vendor thing, or am I even understanding that correctly?
It's pretty much a single vendor thing, right? Because you're looking for somebody to have that unified dashboard construct.
But it's interesting to me to hear you or anyone from Worldwide, because you guys are very good at being agnostic and very focused on outcomes for the customer, regardless of the vendor. And that's one thing I really like. But on this is usually it feels like, do you feel like those technologies are mature enough within a single vendor to say you're not substantially giving up anything by potentially going that route?
Well, this is where you get into the dichotomy, right? Are you choosing best of breed or are you choosing simple, right? So, pick one or the other. So you potentially could be giving up something, right? You may get great wired and wireless. The SD-WAN may not be as robust on one versus, this one's got very robust firewall, but the wireless, not so much, right? So there are some trade-offs that could potentially come in there. It really comes down to what are you trying to do and what's the best fit for your environment, and
I'm only pushing back because everyone used to push back on me because I've long worked for a vendor that pushed the beauty of the single vendor approach, regardless of what the reality was behind the scenes. And sometimes it worked really well. Sometimes it didn't. But I think for most use cases, you're probably just fine. It's an edge, an extreme, heavily regulated, heavily overseen certain environments, or security environments where, yes, you're going to have to get specialized and you're going to invest in the money it takes to do multiple solutions with multiple management consoles and things like this. But so it's interesting to hear you say, because to me that says this is also maybe where the market's going in terms of consolidating, because honestly, at the end of the day, I think other than networking nerds such as ourselves, perhaps, that sounds easier to me. So when we look at these priorities, it's probably a silly question to say you do think WAN optimization, you would agree, is a priority to be taken care of. So we're around networking, the management, increased adoption of cloud, and making sure we're optimized for those things to a good user experience with the understanding that users have changed. Is that a decent summary of kind of where we're at with that?
I think it's a very fair summary. One thing I would say, though, it's optimizing your SD-WAN, not WAN optimization. Only because WAN optimization carries a bit of luggage with it.
Right?
If you think back to the days you were at Cisco,
we're about compression.
Back in the days of WAN, that was called WAN optimization, right? We're talking about optimizing your WAN, not WAN optimization, because WAN optimization is more of a tool than a thought process.
So glad you made that. So glad you made that distinction. And I will still probably continue. I'll continue to reverse those things. But I had written in my notes, I was like, what happened to WAN optimization? because it was kind of fascinating at the time as well, because there were some interesting things that were happening when you really looked at, well, what is eating up my WAN, and really getting down to the level of.
Well, and there's still some of that,
Yeah.
right? There's still some companies that do have good optimization techniques, whether, but as you start to think about it, I'm starting to get now, back in the day when I was on a T1,
Yeah.
that was critical.
Yeah. T1.
I got gig fiber in my
T1?
house.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I've got fiber here as well.
For $40 a month, I'm sitting on gig. So yeah, it's maybe not those tools so much, but how once it leaves my house, how am I optimizing where I'm, my access to applications and stuff,
Yeah,
right?
that makes a lot of sense. I just want to end with anything you can share in terms of recommended next steps for someone engaged. And this is the assumption that hopefully people realize that you're a representative of the intelligence that exists at Worldwide to make this easier and to help people save money and not waste time and investment in directions that aren't supportive of what they want to achieve. Do you have some recommended next steps in terms of what you guys provide service-wise, or what you usually ask people to do?
For people who want to pursue further, right, there's some great collateral up on our platform, www.com, right? If you go to the SD-WAN topic page, you'll find some great articles, as well as on the SASE topic page. You'll see some great articles that outline that. You also see links to some really good labs, right? If you want to get hands-on to test out different SD-WAN vendors in conjunction with different SSE vendors, those labs are up there for free of use to our customers, right? So avail yourself of the great knowledge and the hands-on experience you can drive there, and really dig into something new that they're doing called learning paths. If you want to, which is basically a curriculum, I'm going to walk you through, an SD-WAN OEM from the very beginnings of how you learn it all the way through, let's do the labs and everything else. So a series of articles, videos, labs, and hands-on stuff to get you somewhat, accredited, if you will, in having done the process of learning that particular OEMs or that particular architecture. I think the resources up there are just
and it's
phenomenal.
Amazing too, because I used to make the mistake, and maybe it was like this in the early days, but I remember the first time I was just blown away at looking at the investment that Worldwide had made with the Advanced Technology Center, and I didn't really pay attention to it until COVID shutdowns, and we were doing many more things remotely. But you guys had been early on the remote access to those labs and really enabling it for self-learning to a degree that I usually have not seen anywhere else, unless you were going to pay a learning provider. And even then, they're probably more equipment constrained than you guys are, because you've made so many investments and you amortize it across so many big global customers with your proof of concepts and everything else you have going on constantly.
And the other good thing is that they are multi-OEM, right? So you can test one SD-WAN provider with a different SSE provider, right? Those labs are up there. If you went to just one specific OEM, you're going to see all their stuff and probably nobody else.
Well, and/or how do they work together? Because
Right.
I know you guys do a lot of that cross testing and such like this, and make that available. Amazing stuff. Any final words that are important to remember that maybe I failed to ask you here?
No, I think you hit on all the spots. To your point, I think SD-WAN right now is still a big growing concern in the market for us, right? I think the analytics I've seen in the market, it's about a 50% or so adoption of SD-WAN overall. And we're in the middle, like I said, of a big refresh opportunity on those that have done adoption. A lot of the folks that are just adopting and the ones that are refreshing are the ones coming and look at, okay, what's my next step here, right? I've been doing SD-WAN for 5 years. I'm on the 5-year-old version. What have I missed in the 5 years? What other things can I bring in? Like some of the newer cloud on-ramp, things and stuff like that. So I think we're in a great spot when you're doing that to take a look at that opportunity and relook at what you're doing. And then again, rolling that SSE component in, if that makes sense at that point as well.
Well, Tom, thank you so much. I appreciate you setting time aside to straighten us out on this one and go a little deeper on priority number 2.
Well, I appreciate time, Rob. Good to see you as always.
I always learn a lot from Tom, and I hope you did as well. Because when we look at these network priorities, they might seem obvious at first glance, but there are a couple of critical next steps that I do want to call out. First, if you've not read the report, go do that. But for those pre-existing shows that I teased about earlier, Bob Herbick is a well-known wireless expert for WWT, and he leads our show around this first priority.
Wireless is a little bit of a platform today, and there's a bunch of different ways that you can use wireless. It is more than just Wi-Fi, but that Wi-Fi network can do things like provide location services alongside BLE or Bluetooth Low Energy. But there's other wireless technologies that might be more suitable for the use case that the client is trying to deploy. Things like LoRaWAN for IoT connectivity over long distances, things like private wireless or private 4G, 5G networks that can be deployed, owned by an organization, and utilize those 4G and 5G technologies to provide connectivity over large distances, provide a very low latency or very prescriptive latency connections, and do things around roaming and device coverage that we're just not able to do with Wi-Fi, but even be deployed alongside our Wi-Fi networks.
Now, regarding the prioritization of a converged transport network, Tyler Tappy, we have two guests. Tyler Tappy, with his expertise in optical networking, joined forces with Josh Hogan, who's well-versed in MPLS and segment routing.
In the next iteration of QSFP-D ZR+, there's going to be something called Bright ZR. That has an integrated amplifier, so now we're able to launch into things like contentionless networks, CDC networks. We don't have to amplify as much anymore. So we're able to integrate extra amplification into the plug, and then we don't need as much external amplification, amplifiers and chassis and stuff to launch that thing further.
The biggest single most important thing is that all of the router vendors now can standardize on QSFP-D and just throw these ports under. So the density is really starting to explode. So it's the incredible amount of flexibility and density that you get from this particular version of a port that is just sweeping across all the vendors. And suddenly the industry seems to have really landed on this and said, this is the way we're going to do it.
Please check these things out. They are awesome. So that's 3 for this priority port. My name is Rob Boyd. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope to see you on the next one.